Hello, how we doing? We're going to move on to our conversation regarding sensation. This actually is the lecture, or the half of the lecture we were going to do in class, so I just went ahead and turned it into this video. So we're going to look, we're kind of transitioning from the central nervous system and considering the brain and spinal cord to looking at how we communicate information along our nerve pathways and some of the relationships we have with things like pain and itching and the signaling that occurs as we communicate information back and forth. So let's start with this. When we're talking about sensation, what is a sensation? A sensation is when an internal or external stimulus produces an afferent signal. An internal or external stimulus produces an afferent signal. Now, you may perceive that, you may be aware of that, or you may not. You may have a signal sent from your skin and you understand that. It's sent to your skin, it's sent to your spinal cord, goes to your thalamus, goes to your brain goes, there's something on my skin. Or you could have some sensations that are generated that you're not aware of, like the sensations that we associate with internal stimuli that affect, for example, your blood pressure. So you're aware of some sensations and others you're not. When we talk about the receptors, those things that generate sensations, we can look at them in a number of different ways. We can look at them in terms of where we find them. Interoreceptors are going to be internal receptors, clearly. Exteroreceptors are going to be those that we associate with our external stimulations, like on the skin. And then even proprioception deals with kind of a specialty class of those that we associate with the movement of our muscles and joints. Let me move out of the way here a second. You also can see the types of stimulus received. We can classify receptors based on the kind of information they handle and what they do with it. Mechanoreceptors deal with mechanical stimuli like pressure, so we associate those with touch, but even also with hearing, because our hair cells in our ears are going to move based upon pressure waves. Photoreceptors are in the eye, thermoreceptors for temperature, chemoreceptors for chemicals that we associate with olfactory and gustatory, smelling and taste, and nociceptors, we deal with pain. We also can look at receptors based on how complex they are. You can see some rather simplistic ones over here, with the nerve endings, the free nerve endings are going to be almost like exposed wires for their receptors, versus some rather complex, called encapsulated receptors like you see here with mitral corpuscles or in hearing. And then we'll look at one way of classifying them on the next slide, which is general or special receptors. But what I want to do here before we go on is give you this quote: receptors act as transducers. And you're going, well, yeah, what's that mean? Receptors act as transducers. Receptors change information. They change it from a stimulus to a nerve signal. To transduce means to convert. So receptors are converters. They take a signal and they turn it into a nerve signal. Now, they are quite specialized. Your hearing receptors can't see, your eye receptors can't hear, touch receptors can't taste. So they're specialized. Mechanoreceptors can only handle a certain kind of stimulus, but if that stimulus is present, then they can turn that into a nerve signal, an afferent signal for the brain to interpret. So I mentioned there was one other way of looking at classifying our receptors, and here you see the general way we do this. We can look at our senses, the broad classification of our senses, and the two main categories: general senses, like we see here, and special senses. So general senses include things like touch, pressure, proprioception, pain, pressure. These are going to be things that we consider widespread. The receptors for these are over large parts of the body. You have temperature receptors over large regions of your skin. You have pain receptors over large regions of your skin. The difference between special senses, though, is that these are going to be highly specialized and highly localized receptors. And if you notice where you find smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance, all of these are going to be associated with the head. So general senses are going to be distributed broadly, and the receptors for those are going to be distributed broadly. Special senses are going to be highly localized within the head and are very specialized for certain kinds of sensations. So what we did in class, go back. What we did in class is we said, yeah, okay, so you have a nerve signal sent because some kind of stimulus was perceived, and then we had a nerve signal, and then we followed its propagation. Got it. But we need to back up to the very beginning of that. How does a sensation get started? How does one of these internal or external stimuli actually get turned into a nerve signal? We see here receptors produce a generator or a receptor potential in response to a stimulus. So if we have a stimulus of the right kind, it will actually help us produce an action potential in that receptor. So if you look over here at my little diagram, so we have a stimulus. If its stimulus is the right kind and the right strength, it will trigger an action potential in that receptor. We won't go through the details, but it's very similar to what you've already seen. Essentially, we're going to start moving ions. If enough ions get moved, it triggers a receptor potential, which is the same thing if you want to think of it as a localized action potential. But now we have the beginning of the dominoes. Now we're going to have the action potential is going to be passed along an afferent neuron, and eventually it's going to be ending up in a particular region of the brain, where depending on where it goes, the brain can say, oh, I'm getting a signal here. That tells me that someone's left wrist got stimulated or someone's right knee got stimulated. So depending upon where the signal ends up, after it passes through the thalamus and then goes to the appropriate part of the cerebrum, we can then figure out, I have an itch on my left knee, or I have an itch on my ear. So just giving you some of some sensations, some broad classifications of sensations. I want to show you a few kinds of receptors here. In the skin, obviously we associate touch as the sense of choice here, and you see different kinds of receptors. You see touch and fine touch. Meissner's corpuscles are going to be here. Notice they're near the surface of the skin, and if those are stimulated, it helps us figure out what's called two-point determination. If 2 points are very close on your skin or further away on your skin, you can actually detect that by how these corpuscles are stimulated. Passian corpuscles, you see down here, are going to be for deep pressure. So they're way down here, and they're kind of like onions. They're kind of like layers. The more you mash on your skin, the more you stimulate these, and again, the brain perceives that as that's going to be from a Pacchian corpuscle. Therefore, I need to interpret that as a deep pressure. You also see Merkel discs, hair follicle receptors, what are called the Ruffini end organs, and free nerve endings. Again, all of these are associated with different kinds of pressure. Let me just give you one example of these with the hair follicles. You see that we have these delicate nerve fibers around the hair follicles. So if the hair on your hand gets moved, let's say a mosquito lands on it, you may not know exactly to a pinpoint location where you had a stimulation, but you know something is in that broad area, so you slap. Some more somatic sensations. Thermal, pain, and proprioception are important somatic sensations. Thermal receptors are going to help us figure out cold and warm. You actually have cold receptors and warm receptors. These will also, if it's very cold or very hot, will actually stimulate nociceptors or pain receptors. Pain receptors are interesting because they're irritated by what I call an inflammatory soup. Let's say that you have a scratch on your skin and you have a bunch of injured cells. Those injured cells release chemicals including prostaglandins, ATP, potassium, and when they do, nearby nociceptors detect those and start to send a nerve signal to your brain like, okay, we should be hurting because there's now been an injury. Proprioception deal with receptors that are going to be related to body posture, balance, coordination, and so you're going to find them, and you see this term here, muscle spindles and stretch receptors. We'll mention them a little bit later when we get to reflexes, but the degree of stretch in your muscle can be detected, and because of that, your body can say, I think we need to have a little more stimulation here or a little less there so we can keep our balance. Let's spend just a bit more time here on the idea of pain, because this is actually a big part of many of your careers, is you'll be helping people manage pain. And from a clinical perspective, there's two kinds of pain. There's a somatic pain and a visceral pain. Somatic pain is pain that we associate with skin, that we associate with muscles, that we associate with kind of the stretching of the muscles. So that pain can really be also of two varieties. Somatic pain can be superficial, which, as you might have guessed, is going to deal with the skin. And when we get this kind of pain, it's kind of a sharper pain. It's the pain that we associate with, if somebody, pricks you with a needle. It's that really intense, sharp pain that's traveling on large myelinated fibers. It goes fast, it hurts. The deep somatic pain that we associate with things like muscles or cramps is a slower, aching pain. It doesn't feel as sharp, it's not as acute, and it's more diffuse. Like you have a difficult time saying exactly to a pinpoint location exactly where you may have deep pain. So somatic pain is pain we associate with really muscles, skin, and it can differ based upon kind of where it's found. Visceral pain is once again going to be a pain that is a more diffuse pain, but we associate visceral pain with pain in our abdomen and our thorax. So more of an internal organ pain, if you will, and because it's going to be internal, it's once again a little hard for us to say exactly where something hurts, more of a broad area. But visceral pain sort of has an interesting side note to it, because visceral pain is generated and then passed along the spinal cord, which shares a lot of the same somatic pain roots. Sometimes we are going to perceive visceral pain as somatic pain. Long way of saying, we may not experience pain where we think we do. For someone, and this is a classic one you've heard of, somebody who's having a heart attack will often feel the pain down their left arm. You may have always wondered why the left arm and not the right arm. It's because the heart is going to send signals along the same nerve fibers as the somatic pain roots from our left arm. So someone can be having a heart attack and have left arm pain as characteristic. Their left arm is not in any way damaged or sending a pain signal by itself. It just happens to be where we perceive the pain. So many times people who are having referred pain can point to a location and saying, this hurts, but that's actually not the exact part of their body that hurts. For example, one I've always found curious is the right shoulder. If someone's having a gallbladder attack, will sometimes complain of pain in the right shoulder. And you may be thinking, well, they pulled a muscle, rather than thinking they may be having a gallbladder attack. So this chart is kind of a cool way of looking at where we perceive pain, like the lungs and the diaphragm may be pain we perceive here, but the pain itself is actually originating somewhere else. It's just traveling along a nerve route that we might misinterpret its location. A few more pain thoughts. People will say sometimes, I have a really high pain threshold. That's actually not correct. Pain threshold is the point at which we biologically perceive pain. So all of us are going to perceive pain at the same rough temperature of hot water, for example. 45 degrees Celsius, we put our hands in that, we're going to experience pain because biologically that's when we trigger pain receptors. Your pain tolerance, though, may vary. Maybe you really can't handle pain very much. If you have any kind of slightest bit of pain, it for you is debilitating. For someone else, they can kind of shake it off. Pain tolerance is different than pain threshold. Pain threshold is when pain receptors get stimulated. Pain tolerance is how well you handle that. When we talk about pain, normally pain is good. And you're thinking, Mr. B, that's not good. Pain actually is good because it tells you that some part of the body is not fully functional and you shouldn't use it. If you sprain your ankle and you get pain from your sprained ankle, it makes you not walk on your ankle anymore and do further damage. However, pain can also be not helpful and even debilitating. There are people who experience pain chronically. They have, more than 2 million Americans have pain that really can't be fixed or controlled by medications, because the pain source or the way they perceive the pain is simply not, we can't address it through chemical means. It can lead to people having a depression, drug abuse, because they're in such pain all the time, they don't get any relief. It also even leads to increased risk of suicide. So we think of pain as something that we can normally fix. You take Advil, you take some serious medication, you take morphine, and we can get rid of pain. But for many Americans, they can't, because either a pathologic process or some other trauma that simply we can't chemically address, and therefore they have persistent pain. One other kind of weird issue that can come with pain that we should mention here is phantom pain. And we talked about a little bit in class, but somebody who has an amputation, it can experience pain in the missing part of their body. So in this individual here, the pain in their right leg, in their foot, for example, they may complain of pain in their right foot, and you're thinking they can't have pain there because they don't have a right foot. It doesn't mean that they're making it up. It truly could be their brain is interpreting signals, or it's basically making up signals that really truly are pain signals, and it's perceiving it. And we know now maybe how to address this more than we used to. In the old days, if someone had to have a foot amputated, we'd put them under general anesthesia, and we would amputate the foot, and we'd bring them back, and then maybe a week or 2 or 3 later, they would start complaining about phantom pain. Now one of the therapies they use during surgery is, in addition to the amputation, they give the person an epidural. So they're also blocking the spinal cord nerve signals. So what probably is going on is the spinal cord, quote unquote, learns during that surgery, even with an epidural, that when that part is gone, not to expect signals from it, where previously it still expected signals and therefore would generate them even without that part being there. So it's an interesting way of having to deal with phantom pain. Again, we used to treat it as a psychological concern, that they just can't accept the fact that their limb is gone. Actually, there's a physiologic basis that the epidurals do seem to help. Well, how do we then get relief from pain? What are some of the ways that drugs do work? Some drugs actually block the generation of pain signals, and that deals with how do you deal with like anti-inflammatories. They actually deal with those chemicals that are generated by cells that are damaged. Some drugs actually affect the perception of pain in the brain, and so if you don't perceive pain, even though you're getting pain signals sent from a sensory region, if you don't perceive it, then you don't actually experience any negative effects. Local anesthetics, again, may work at a level where they're interrupting the neuron transmission, like we talked about with Novocaine. General anesthesia, if you're put out, if you are knocked out for surgery, for example, actually affects the RAS. We talked about the reticular activating system. The general anesthesia tends to affect the brainstem and therefore blocks all pain signals and all transmission of signals while you are in surgery. A couple more thoughts here and then we'll wrap up. The gate control theory of pain is an interesting one, and I can give you a great example of this. Let's say that you are walking in your house and you bump your knee on a piece of furniture and you begin to throb. What do you do sometimes? You may rub your knee a few times really fast, and all of a sudden it seems to feel a little bit better. Why would that be the case? The gate control theory of pain says the brain can process certain amounts of signals from a certain part of the body and no more. So if you start sending nerve signals to your brain that your knee is throbbing and you bumped it, and you begin to rub your knee really fast and kind of rub it and scratch it or whatever, you may actually be activating large myelinated sensory fibers, which then kind of override, they overwhelm the pain signal, and so it does appear to feel better. So the gate control theory of pain is an interesting one because it actually gets into the idea of how much information the brain can process and handle related to our sensations. And I do want to mention that the body produces its own opiates and endorphins, so it does produce its own chemicals that actually help us deal with pain. The idea of you running at a marathon and you've been running now 16, 17, 18 miles, and then you get this kind of rush of relief. Now you feel a lot better. The brain does actually produce some of its own endorphins, and endorphins actually do block pain signals. One final point I want to mention here, and that deals with sort of a unique kind of pain in itching. When we talk about itching, what's going on here and why is it sort of a different kind of pain signal? It actually is a mechanism to protect our skin. Lots of things can stimulate our skin to itch. It can be anything from insect bites to certain kinds of chemicals can cause us to want to scratch our skin. So we look at kind of two types of itch, and there's two different mechanisms involved here. A contact itch is when you do have something on your skin, and the idea here is if you get a plant chemical, or if you have clothing, or you have something resting on your skin causing it to itch, by scratching you are removing it. That is the point of getting the irritant off, is that you scratch it and remove it. An invasive itch is when you have something kind of inside the skin, and now we're going to think about like an insect bite. So if you have an invasive itch, let's say a mosquito bites you and you begin to scratch that, it's because inside of your skin you have what are called mast cells. Mast cells are immune cells that release histamine. So histamine is a way, and you get to this more in AMP2, but histamine is an anti-inflammatory response. We're trying to kind of keep this site of that infection, of that insect toxin, for example, from going too far. So that histamine is going to be released as a way of stimulating that reaction. So when you scratch because of that, you are scratching because of a histamine reaction. Obviously, antihistamines are to counteract those reactions. Of course, if you scratch too hard, you can break your skin, break it open and cause infection, so don't do that. And one thing about skin and itching, rather, that's kind of cool is it's psychosomatic. If you see somebody doing this for a while, you're just sitting there watching them, and all of a sudden you begin to perceive that you have itches too. And we don't really know why that's true. But, itching and yawning are kind of two interesting psychosomatic responses where if you see somebody else do it, then all of a sudden you feel a need to do it too. That's going to deal our videos over here for sensation. We'll move on to a couple more. Thanks.